Hello everybody, and thank you for joining. We'll begin the webinar. We've got 30 minutes here, and I've got about 40 slides to go through. So before we get going, and I will do that quickly, just a little bit of housekeeping to get out of the way first, so that everybody knows we've got a copy of this presentation in the GoToMeeting portion here under the download section. If you can't figure that out, don't worry about it. We'll be sending out a copy of the presentation and a recording of this webinar to all attendees. That's me. My name is Nader. I'm the Vice President of Consulting at SQM Group. I have the distinction and honestly the best job at SQM, I can say that now because nobody else can talk, around the fact that we really help measure and benchmark so many companies, and my position here really enables me to compile all of the best practices across world-class contact centers, describe those contact centers, compile them, and really disseminate that information out to our clients. So this is a big part about what we're doing here today. And the topic of that presentation is really going to be around the escalations, how to deal with those properly, and we'll get into that topic shortly. A tiny bit about SQM first. Ultimately, our mission is really helping organizations improve their customer and employee experience, right down to the individual level. And a lot of this is going to come down to how individuals handle escalations, both individual contact centers, but ultimately the individual agents that you have on the phone, both as frontline CSRs and escalation agents, and how those calls and escalations are handled. Our three main pillars at SQM really revolve firstly around the research that we collect, and we'll get into the surveys that we do here in a minute, the consulting portion of what we do, and ultimately the awarding. We work with around 500 plus contact centers that we're benchmarking on an annual basis at this point. We've been around the block a few times here since 1996. That ultimately leads to our completing 1.5 million some odd surveys with customers every year. We do about 25,000 surveys with employees as well around their employee satisfaction every year. As far as the locations and demographics that we work in, the majority of our work is really North America wide, with the bulk of the work that we're doing with mostly American companies at this point. But we are historically a Canadian company with 2 head offices, and that's a big piece about what we do differently as well. Not only are we benchmarking other contact centers, we run 2 contact centers ourselves with world-class employee satisfaction that we're incredibly proud of in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Vernon, British Columbia, Canada. So this is what we're here to talk about today. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is really focus on what an effective call escalation process is, so that ultimately we can help avoid additional contacts from customers. We can improve their overall experience, reducing costs at the same time as improving customer retention. So when a call is ultimately handled by some sort of escalation agent or a support queue, and a call goes unresolved from that point, just about 1/3 of every one of those escalations that's unresolved expresses an intent to defect from your organization. So the big business case here to me is whether or not customers have a choice doesn't matter as much as their perception. When you're escalating something as a customer and you get to an escalation queue and you perceive that the issue is still unresolved, just about 1/3 of those people are saying, look, if I have the choice, I'm going to go look somewhere else. So within this webinar, explicitly what we're going to touch on, it's the impact of those unresolved calls and what they can have on your metrics like your FCR and your customer satisfaction. Why complaint customers really are the best people to be surveying to figure out opportunities to improve your customer experience. And then we're going to get into a proven complaint handling process for agents and escalation agents. We'll talk a bit about the metrics that we should be really focusing on to measure customer complaints. And then we're going to get into best practices for how to fix them. So first off, let's talk about the why. What really matters to callers when they're contacting a call center is truly centered around the idea that you can resolve my inquiry, And across the 1.5 million surveys that we're doing, this data is extremely robust to point you very clearly towards, look, if we have to focus on one thing, what really should that thing be? The primary determinant of success in a contact center environment, with or without an escalation, is to focus holistically on getting resolution from the customer's perception. It's not to say that treating customers as though they're important or personalizing their service or ultimately rewarding them for their loyalty are unimportant things to people. It's just that the most important thing to people is that they are able to have their inquiry resolved. You called me for a reason, let me make sure I can resolve it. These are the metrics that really drive customer experience. So when we talk about metrics and what drives customer experience, we're really focused on the difference between what metrics lead a better customer experience to what metrics really are lagging indicators of customer experience. The leading indicators are what drive the improvement in your lagging indicators. So everybody out there is really looking for an improvement in customer experience and greatness. And many of you are focused maybe on the idea of retaining customers, retention scores, or promotion scores through an NPS score. One of the greatest difficulties I see in the contact center industry, and one of the big differentiators between world-class contact centers and average contact centers, truly is in the understanding that what's driving those lagging indicators, the stuff we're really looking for from a business metric measurement system in NPS or Net Retention Index, really comes from and stems from how effective we are at resolving inquiries on the first contact. Be that call resolution at the agent level, first contact resolution at the call center level, or really the idea of understanding one contact resolution across all of your channels at an enterprise level. Here's why we're still so focused on FCR. Though the industry continues to evolve, what really hasn't changed over time, again, is that intent, the customer's perception that I'm phoning you for a reason. Please resolve the reason for my call so I don't have to call you back again. Very typically, people can address this line of sight that for every 1% improvement in first call resolution that you get, you reduce operating costs by the equitable 1% here. So for every 1% in FCR you get, you reduce operating costs by 1% because you're preventing another call from coming in tomorrow. The other really neat thing about FCR is that there's no other metric out there that is more closely correlated to improving customer satisfaction and their experience than FCR. There's an equitable 1% improvement in customer satisfaction for every 1% gain that you get in FCR. To make customers happier, resolve more of their contacts on one call. Employee satisfaction, and this is one that's very typically overlooked in the contact center industry, and I've spoken about this before for any of you who have heard, but ultimately one of the greatest overlooked impacts of improving FCR truly is the benefit you get to employee satisfaction, and the call center industry in general is very good about talking to agents about putting a smile in their voice and being happy, because happy employees make happy customers. The inverse is actually also true, and nobody really talks about that, in that happier customers make happier employees. So for every 1% improvement that you get in FCR, typically it equates to a 1 to 5 time magnifier in employee satisfaction too. And here's why. Ultimately, if your FCR is sitting at around that 50% mark, meaning that every second call an agent is picking up, it's the customer's second, third, fourth, or 15th time that they're having to call in, that really wears on agents, having to spend the first 30 seconds of an interaction apologizing, pretending or trying to do something different than the last 2 or 3 or 15 people that caller spoke to. But if your FCR is up at around that world-class level of 80+%, what that really equates to is that pretty much every contact that an agent is going to get before they pick the phone up, they know 8 out of every 10 calls I answer today, there's going to be a good chance I'm going to resolve this inquiry in a way that leaves this customer not needing to call us back again. Increased opportunities to sell. So for anybody who's doing and interested in cross-sell opportunities, there's really, really clear data around improving your opportunity to sell by the tune of around 20% when you can achieve first contact resolution as opposed to when you can't. So it drives higher sales when you can first resolve an inquiry and then shift into a cross-sale. at the same time, and the one that I believe should be really talked about a lot more too, is reducing customers at risk and churn. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in this presentation, but ultimately 98% of customers are completely protected within your business when you can achieve FCR. It's when you can't achieve FCR that you really see those defection numbers and the customer's expressed intent to defect increasing. So let's define what the problem is here. And we'll talk first about the things that everybody can kind of articulate probably pretty well. Why are escalated calls so much trickier? Well, first point is that they really are more complex a lot of the time. Duh. Okay, everybody gets it. That escalations are probably trickier interactions. That's very true. Improperly staffed escalation queues also have a very large impact on getting through to an agent. And a customer having to hold for too long and getting through to an escalated agent often leaves them wanting to hang the phone up and call back at a later time. Contact centers by default make it intrinsically difficult for customers to have their call escalated or transferred to an escalation agent. One of the greatest differences between world-class organizations and average organizations is the fact that they've successfully navigated the paradigm shift from trying to avoid or mitigate escalations into truly celebrating them. I know it sounds cheesy, but I'll prove my point out here in a bit. Ultimately, they've embraced a much higher level of accountability to resolving calls than the average contact center, and that really stems from creating environments where it's much easier for people to have inquiries transferred and escalated. Escalation agents also are typically pretty good at answering the what, answering the questions. They really struggle a lot of the times with the service recovery opportunities, the how they're talking to people. And one of the big fail points that I really see in the contact center industry and escalations truly is not in the skill capacity of escalation teams, it's in how they resolve the customer problem. Customers also ultimately needing to repeat their issue when they're getting escalated and transfers leads to issues in driving multiple repeat calls, and we'll talk about what a warm transfer really is here. Most contact centers also don't actually measure the customer perceived metrics around first contact or call resolution or the customer satisfaction performance of their escalation team explicitly. They also don't measure the employee satisfaction of the agents escalating calls to that escalation team. We'll talk about that later as well. Some contact centers still don't have dedicated agents to handle escalated calls. Many of them are on an ad hoc basis transferring any escalated interactions to a supervisor or any team lead that's available, and that typically drives a lot of dissatisfaction and FCR impacts in an escalated situation. Agents are also discouraged, like I said, from using an escalation queue and are sometimes even reprimanded if they do so too often, which drives agents to wanting to avoid transferring to escalation queues because ultimately they feel as though they're going to get in trouble for doing so. Or the escalation team may sometimes be perceived as being condescending towards the agents. So ultimately there are two factors here. Do you have any KPIs or measurement that might drive agents to feel like they shouldn't be transferring calls? Are they penalized in some way for transferring or escalation calls? Number one. And number two, is there a culture between your escalation queue and your frontline staff that might lead the perception that the escalation agents could be condescending towards me? If I were an agent, I'm going to avoid that interaction then. And finally, here's why those cultures typically exist, is that agents can often treat an escalation queue as a dumping ground for calls that they just don't want to handle. So on one side, we're saying, look, we really need to make it easy and empower agents to use a successful and effective escalation queue. But on the other hand, it cannot be a dumping ground for a call you just don't want to handle. Here's the impact to FCR as it relates to that important concept that I talked about earlier of defection. And to me, this should be one of really the biggest business cases to make around why we want to continually focus on reducing repeat contacts and improving FCR. When we can achieve first call resolution, and that happens to the tune of 72% on average across the industry, only 2% of people wake up on the wrong side of the bed and they're still going to express their intent to defect from your organization. So even when you achieve FCR, 2% of people are going to have an issue with your policies, your product, your service, and they're going to try and look somewhere else to a competitor for an alternative. If their issue is unresolved on the first call, but they ultimately get their issue resolved at some point, making 2, 3, 4, or 15 calls, on average that happens 16% of the time in the industry, but that number jumps up to 5% of defections. So you can see how it more than doubles, 2.5 times the number of defections when you resolve a call, but you make people jump through too many hoops, too many repeat contacts to get it done. Here's the big impact though. The 12% of the time where calls go unresolved, just about a quarter of those people are expressing their intent to defect from your organization. So really the point here is to start thinking about how much does a customer mean to us? And what does it mean for us to resolve calls? How difficult are we making it for people to resolve calls? How much effort do we want to go through and accountability do we want to go through in trying to reduce the unresolved caller here so that we can prevent defection? Here's how we're going to fix it. So in world-class contact centers, one of the big differentiators that I see is truly this culture of accountability that I talked about. They not only talk about it, but they really drive metrics, performance accountability, rewards and recognition towards this mantra of whoever hears a call owns the call. So that the first agent that handles a call and every call they handle, they really should feel that they need to attempt as much as possible in order to resolve a customer's problem, i.e. create this culture of willingness to want to resolve so that the escalation queue does not become a dumping ground. At the same time, they need to be encouraged to be able to transfer calls to an escalation queue in order to drive resolution. So ultimately, if an agent feels as though they're not able to resolve a call, it really needs to become the rule that instead of saying, thanks very much, have a great day, knowing that they're going to call us back again maybe in 5 minutes or 5 days, that we really make an effort to increase the accountability to transferring that call today to an escalation specialist to prevent tomorrow's call. Ultimately, that drives much more ownership at the agent level to resolve every single call. For an escalated call or any agent-assisted call, that there's still that agent-level accountability to resolving an inquiry. How you do that is incredibly important. The idea of a warm transfer and escalating through to a support team truly is the best practice. There are one of 2 ways that you need to do this. A warm transfer needs to be the rule to your escalation queue. You can think about the logistics behind needing to support a team then, in that there needs to be real-time access for an agent to an escalation queue. What that means is that the agent takes the customer along the journey of that transfer so that the caller can hear what the agent is summarizing to that escalation agent as they transfer the call. It's very important that distinction is made, because typically in the call center industry, I see a misconception about this warm transfer. And it's that the first agent will explain to the second agent what's happening, but they're on mute. The only time that should happen, and that's the second point here in the middle, is that if the caller is angry or frustrated, or when there's an aggravation with the first agent, we don't want to aggravate that caller further. What we do is we put the caller on mute as we make that transfer, but we still explain to the second agent the situation and then make that connection. And the whole point here is to try and mitigate the customer from needing to repeat themselves and start over again. Escalation agents ultimately need to see the call as a gift, and it's one of the cheesiest things that I'll say to you today, but ultimately an agent who's in an escalation queue needs to understand that they will be dealing with a lot more service recovery opportunities, and that's how they need to be dealing with and handling every one of the escalations that they're getting, is that it's a gift to try and save a customer's satisfaction or prevent them from defecting from the organization. The escalation agent ultimately is the person who takes ownership for resolving a problem, and they really have a much higher, a much more elevated and an empowered description in their role to be able to resolve customer inquiries. This also means that they need to have the soft skills as well as the knowledge to handle problems. I said at the beginning that typically escalation agents are deemed to be effective once they have an appropriate level of knowledge or tenure. But a lot of the times people forget that in order to get resolution in an escalation, you really first need to resolve the customer issue first. And a lot of the times that's soft skills. And if you don't have agents that can handle the soft skill portion of fixing the customer first, they will not fix the problem. The escalation team can really be set up in many ways, but ultimately the best way I see escalation teams structured is through a Tier 1 versus a Tier 2 escalation agent, where those agents in a Tier 1 are really there to help frontline staff. They're not taking over calls. They're there to help the agent in real time when and if they can't find the information that they need. A Tier 2 agent really is that agent who can take over a call and handle an escalation call. Those are the ones that we're talking about that need both the knowledge and the soft skill to de-escalate issues and ultimately lead to higher resolution in an escalation queue. Here's the how escalation teams typically need to be set up, or the best practice that I see across world-class contact centers. On the left here, you can sort of see some of the setup components around the fact that I really see success in centralized working areas being where you're housing your escalation team, that they truly are the hub that people go to for help in the middle of work areas. They need to be available in real time, and ultimately they're dedicated agents to be helping and assisting an escalated call as opposed to an overflow agent or a tenured agent. They need to treat their your frontline staff as their customer. They have really two customers here, one in understanding that the caller is their customer, and a very important one, but ultimately that the escalation that's coming from that agent, the agent is their customer too. They need to be measured and held accountable to both of those customers. The call resolution from a caller perspective is very important, but also the employee satisfaction in how well they're able to support your frontline staff in helping them resolve calls is vital. And we're going to get to a poll in a minute here when I finish the other side, but it's one of the big gaps that I see in the call center industry, that while many people might measure escalation staff customer perceptions, they really don't do a good job in measuring the agent satisfaction with that escalation team. And that really comes back to that culture I was talking about at the beginning. If the agents don't feel good about escalating calls, you can have the best escalation team that's out there, and you're going to have a much reduced impact because agents aren't going to be willing to want to make those transfers. So the proper escalation to support ratio really needs to be the frontline staff to escalation support ratio that I see best is around that 15-to-1 mark. Cost typically plays a role here. So what I would really advocate, and I see working really well, is don't thin the ratio, but pick and choose which lines of business are really the most impactful areas that you want to support, and support them in a really effective way at around that 15-to-1 mark. So really focus on the lines of business that are driving your FCR issues, and focus on supporting those better with a properly staffed escalation queue. Fulfillment and your fulfillment teams in your departments really need to have some sort of reporting relationship back to the call center. When your fulfillment is accountable to the calls that you're taking, you see a much reduced escalation impact because people are getting their fulfillment done the way it was promised and when it was promised to them. An effective and efficient knowledge management tool is really there and available to assist agents to resolve calls. You'll be able to mitigate a lot of the calls and the contacts from coming in if your agents really are empowered to use and have a tool that is effective in preventing escalations so that they can get the knowledge they need to resolve customer inquiries without escalating them. And this is actually at the end of my presentation here, the best practice winner that won the award for escalation last year that we celebrated back in May. Electronic Arts, they really did a phenomenal job about creating an open environment where transfers to escalation really are celebrated, but at the same time they put some really neat artificial intelligence chat functionality in between the escalation that's happening, so that truly, if it is a knowledge gap, that many of the agents are able to de-escalate inquiries themselves through an artificial intelligence chat bot of being able to resolve and respond to internal inquiries that prevents the need for a Tier 2 escalation. And I'll get to that at the end of this presentation. Ultimately, your escalation queue also needs to be used as a function of focusing on retaining customers, or the perception that a caller wants to do business with you. The agent really should feel as though they can transfer the caller at any point when they feel that the caller might want to leave the organization. And that stems back to when the issues are not resolved. Escalated calls also represent the best opportunity to understand where you can improve your FCR. So if you're really looking at the areas that you can work on for low-lying fruit, start focusing on and bucketing the areas that you're escalating the majority of your calls to, and create training and refresher programs around some of those opportunities, both in the what people need to say and in the how they need to say it to de-escalate caller. So the perception is out there as well that escalations typically are complaints, which is true. We know they're more complex, but the call center industry is also, it's really good at thinking about the 13% of calls that come in as complaints. The vast majority, it's almost 90% of calls that come in where there really is no customer perception of complaint, but customers do perceive that about 13% of the time here, when they're calling in a call center, it is to complain about something. So I want to talk about that paradigm shift that we talked about earlier in how you handle a complaint call most effectively. So first, the old way of thinking, and what I would say is still the majority of the average contact centers I work with truly wrestle with what to do with complaints. And complaints really are perceived to be a hassle. That new paradigm that I talked about, where world-class organizations really do view them in that cheesy way that they truly are a gift from the customer, because they understand that an escalated complaint represents an opportunity to recover, a service recovery opportunity, a customer experience recovery opportunity, and ultimately a retention opportunity for this customer. People feel traditionally that callers are always trying to get something for free, which depending on your industry, that may or may not happen to varying degrees. But I would tell you that the majority of customer complaints are completely legitimate. I would put you in your own shoes and how you interact with other companies and other contact centers and how many times you've had to have your complaint escalated. And I would really try and force you guys to think about, are those valid complaints, or are people truly out there trying to get free service? Customers who don't complain are also satisfied, and that's one of those old ways of thinking that really, if we don't hear that squeaky wheel, everything is probably fine. And ultimately what we're seeing is that the complaints that ultimately bubble to the top and the people who are willing to raise their voices are really the tip of the iceberg. So in understanding and identifying the root of escalations and fixing those, you can ultimately have a much larger impact than just the 13% of those calls that are coming in as complaints. A lot of companies also don't actually understand or have a definition for what a customer complaint is. And what I'm seeing now in a lot of world-class contact centers is that they have very formally defined, identified, they're able to track and can resolve to a greater degree their complaint calls that are coming in. Compensation does not equate to forgiveness. So it's not about throwing dollars at this situation, and I've alluded to this a few times now. It really means fixing the customer first and the problem second. Many times through an escalation, what needs to happen in order to de-escalate the situation is to show the customer that you understood them, that you're willing to help, that you're able to help, and that you can resolve their inquiry. But the first thing is listening and understanding. And finally, that it costs too much to handle complaints. And that's really an old way of thinking that really doesn't value the lifetime value of a customer. So in taking a peek at the time here, what I want to do is the last piece here around how you mess up, fess up, and make up. These are the 3 rules around how to de-escalate calls, and ultimately what you really need to understand is acknowledgement. Your agents need to be okay with acknowledging that there might have been an error. We need to take accountability for that and finally lead to a position where we can fix the customer first and then resolve their inquiry. If we try and just tactically come at this by resolving their problem, escalations tend to blow up a lot more. If we focus on resolving the customer first and their feelings and their interaction, we'll be able to get a higher proportion of resolution in escalation. And lastly, I would leave you with this link to our best practice winner, the one I alluded to earlier, that Electronic Arts, and how they've been able to improve satisfaction of the agent and the customer through the way that they've tried to support an escalation queue better by reducing escalations through artificial intelligence. It's one of the many ways that I've seen that work in making sure that the escalation team doesn't become a dumping ground, to make sure that the escalations that come through to your Tier 2 team really are valid escalations and something that you can support in a way that really leaves you at that 15-to-1 ratio a lot easier, because the number of escalations that are coming in are a lot better. Thank you very much for your time, everybody. I'm just over here, so I really appreciate everybody sticking around. Thank you so much. We look forward to it. Again, everybody will get a copy of this presentation in their email, as well as a recording of what we've just been through. Thanks a lot, and have an excellent day.